Welcome, future ancestors, to the second season of Fostering Our Earth, the podcast and newsletter where we imagine what our sustainable future can actually look like. We're going to kick this second season off with a nice and super chill get-to-know-me episode. I'm joined by my friend and colleague Shika Srinivas, who will be joining me as a co-host for a few episodes this season. So I figured we use this time just for y'all to get to know us a bit. We actually recorded this episode about a year ago, but I've been saving it for this moment in time. In this conversation, we share with each other some of our recent and favorite books and podcasts, and talk about how we interact with all things climate and sustainability. We share a lot of recommendations, so check out the description below and the accompanying newsletter on Substack to find links to everything. Folks, I'm super excited for this season where we'll explore so many crucial topics for our sustainable transition. With the Trump administration now fully in office, we need to stay grounded and focused more than ever. And I hope that Fostering Our Earth can be a space for you to turn to. Now, without further ado, let's get into it.
Thank you for having me, Awoe. And yes, this has been a long time coming, and we've talked about this informally in so many ways. So I'm excited to actually be here with you and be on Fostering the Earth. My name is Shika Srinivas. I am a sustainability consultant at Arup, which is an engineering and design firm focused on the built environment. Me and Awoe have reflected a lot on our roles and getting to work on the intersection of sustainability and equity, which is really important. We both met when we were at Stanford doing a master's in sustainable design and construction, and that's also where I did my undergrad in environmental engineering, and I also minored in human rights. So got to explore environmental justice a little bit through my major, but a lot through my minor and other courses that were starting to pop up and other sort of student groups and initiatives that were popping up too when I was an undergrad. I grew up in Central California, which is where a lot of my climate story starts, because Bakersfield, where I grew up, is definitely a hub for production of fossil fuels, as is the Central Valley in California. And so having that kind of be the landscape I grew up in and seeing the way that city design also leads to sort of your lifestyle. For example, I couldn't wait to drive and get a car because the public transit in Bakersfield has a lot to improve on. I just became very kind of infatuated with the link between cities and how you nudge behavior change for sustainability and sustainable industries and all of that, which is how I got into civil engineering and environmental engineering in the first place. So I kind of went backwards, like where I am, how we met, where I started. But yeah, have always cared about making the built environment more sustainable and focusing my time and effort with my career and otherwise in climate action and climate justice.
So every time we catch up, we always share different books that we're reading. We share different podcasts, like a couple you just share with me I listen to, and they become part of my regular rotation. And I feel like I learned so much from just interacting with this other media and content. A lot of folks reach out or they'll say like, what more could we read or what more could I listen to? And then I was like, okay, let's share this with everyone. And like, it could be a good way for folks to get plugged into the climate world, because we see a lot of news about whether it's hurricanes or wildfires and everything is record breaking and extreme temperatures. And it's like, where do I fit in all this? How do I start? And so I figured let's share some of our favorite content. And I know we do this for our work. Like we work in sustainability, we work in the built environment, but we choose to engage with this outside of that. And so with that, we could start with just a discussion off, like, just share with me a couple of your favorite books that you've read in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to stop me if I keep going on and on. I would say my favorite book that I've read most recently is probably Braiding Sweetgrass, which this has been on my list for years. So I'm glad that 2023 was the year I actually picked it up. I opened it, I got into it. And it's this just beautiful set of stories and illustrations from Dr. Robin Kimmerer, who is both a trained botanist, has her PhD, is teaching actively in the field doing research, but also is Indigenous, and the ways that she melded her ways of knowing and being and interacting with the environment, her indigeneity, her family's traditions, with the type of learning and analysis that was taught in the more Western stream of science. And it's just a book that's so poetically written, and it feels like it reminds me how much it's important to be grounded in the work we're doing by being grounded in the environment itself in a way. And it's not quite the more mainstream narrative of like, let's go hiking. It's a lot more about getting to know the environment around you and having a deeper respect and appreciation for co-living with the environment. An idea that I really resonated with is the way that Kimmer is able to identify the different plants that occupy the spaces that she lives in, and like understanding what the idea of a neighbor is beyond just people, but also the beings and species that inhabit where we live. So just a beautiful, beautiful book. It really brings up a lot of Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous science, and honors the way that Indigenous cultures have been enormous stewards of our built environment.
Well, that's so cool. And it's also been on my list to read, and I need to get into it because you're making a couple good points. I saw a post a while back that was like, name these 10 different brands. And then I was like, oh yeah, McDonald's, Starbucks, whatever. But then it was like, name these 10 different plants. And I was like, I can't do this. This is not good. Like, how are we so disconnected from the world that we are in and we live in? And so that's a good shout.
Yeah. I really appreciate all the ways she talks about bringing sort of nature in full force and front view with our lives, and what it means to be a steward, like in your own backyard. Like she'll talk about the things that she does to maintain like the meadow and the creeks like near her home, or some of the traditions she has around foraging and collecting. And so it's really beautiful, and there's so many wonderful stories about like different perspectives, different mythology around like Indigenous storytelling about the environment and its role. And I feel this too with like even prayers that I grew up with, but the idea that we live in reciprocity with nature and we should be grateful and thanking nature, as opposed to the more capitalist view. We can engineer nature. Nature is for our consumption. Resources are for us to master. Like that kind of like moving away from that type of framework and moving into one where we think about reciprocity and collaboration, not only with each other, but with our natural and built environment, I think is like, I'm really drawn to media that continues to do that, and imagine what that transition looks like from what we're used to now.
Yeah, you'll love Fresh Banana Leaves by Jessica Hernandez. It takes you into thinking about Indigenous science, and it's sort of flipping the script on how we think about our relationship with the earth and what progress means, and not this extractive, always taking, but also co-living and understanding how nature can help us. So you'll love it.
I'm so excited to read it. Yes. So yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass is probably on my number one list. Or I don't need to rank all of these books. Yeah. They're all amazing in different ways. But high up on the list. Yeah, I could talk about more.
Let's go. What's the next one?
Another very popular climate book is All We Can Save, which is an anthology of essays by different climate justice leaders, scientists, professionals, people working in climate around the world, and primarily centered on women and people of color and their voices and their leadership. So it's an anthology that was put together by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Dr. Catherine Wilkinson. And so I think it also shares a lot of the sentiments that I really liked from Braiding Sweetgrass, which is the storytelling of why we care about the environment. Like there is the objective facts of the way that we've mistreated the environment and the way industrialization and all of these different forces have really put it through so much. But there's also so much hope in the storytelling of what environmental stories do we all have that connect us? Like what kind of work have we done that has inspired us? Like I think working in climate, there's always a couple of moments that keep you hanging on when it feels like a very difficult set of circumstances to be working against, when you keep reading that things are getting way worse. And even in the work world, like I see some of the constraints of bureaucracy and life and money always pushing against the level of progress that we need to make. So this book is just it outlines a lot of relationships between the environment, cities, people, justice, and also has a lot of different sort of perspectives. And so it's also like sort of, I think, mapped onto like plant cycles, like nourish, plant, grow. I can't remember the exact kind of phrasing, but once again, it's like that idea of seeing ourselves more similarly and taking care of ourselves, and then if we can learn to take care of ourselves and nourish ourselves, how we nourish like the causes that we work on. Yeah. So another great set of essays. And yeah, good primers too to get, like, if you're not familiar with climate, the built environment, the state of the world. Like, I feel like even me, and maybe you feel this way too, sometimes I'm so deep in one subject that I forget how many, like, what is the difference between 1.5 and 2 and 2.5? Like, some of those very high level climate taglines almost, I kind of forget in being deep in. So it's kind of nice to take a step back and have people who are experts kind of continue to remind me of the bigger picture and then how it narrows into the smaller pictures that we're now working in our work world and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, that's a really good shout. All We Can Say was definitely one of my favorite books also. I think, like you're saying, it does a really good job of like making our climate and ecological crisis very approachable, but also offering lots of hope and lots of beauty and working to alleviate some climate anxiety. And it's a really fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. It makes me feel warm feelings and energizes me in some ways. And I think one of my favorite parts, they use the term solastalgia. And it's like us longing for the future, or like missing the future that we're not going to have. And it's sort of like defining this new lexicon of terms to explain how we feel, what climate makes us feel. And it's just one tiny aspect of like the amazing essays and poems that were in the book. So yeah, that's a fantastic shout.
Hey y'all, so Awoe here as I edit this podcast, and I just want to correct myself since I totally just botched this definition of solastalgia. This term solastalgia is a powerful concept that helps us name a specific type of like emotional distress that many of us are experiencing in the climate crisis. Unlike nostalgia, which is the longing for places from our past, solastalgia describes the pain we feel when our home environments are transformed around us while we're still living there. So instead of thinking about it as like a future loss, it's more referring to the distress we feel about environmental changes that are currently happening or are already happening while we're still living in our homes. There's a nonprofit called Climate Words that is working to empower action through solutions-oriented climate literacy. So essentially, like, they're defining keywords such as solastalgia and putting it all together in this sort of lexicon of keywords about the climate crisis and how it makes us feel. I've added links to Climate Words in the show descriptions for you all to check them out. But for now, back to the episode.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you and reminded me of that term, solastalgia. There was a couple of terms I now want to jog my memory about. More functionally, if someone is not a big reader or doesn't have like a long attention span, like some of these essays are 2 pages, like an article that was published. Some of them are 16 pages, have research, have personal experience, have recordings of reports, all of that. And so you can kind of find the level of attention that you want to pay or find the right level of reading for yourself too. So very functionally, it's a great book for just picking up when you have 5 to 10 minutes here and there or longer. And you can kind of choose your own adventure with how much you want to read.
For sure. And all of these also have an audio version.
Yeah. I have to get into the audio version of things more. I feel like I've been listening to less work, like podcasts and audiobooks, because sometimes when I'm working, I find if I have to focus, I end up not listening to the podcast, which is fine. Sometimes it's nice to have background noise, but I'm trying to figure out which podcasts I'm doing something totally like mindless, either at home or in life, or which ones require more brain power. Like, what are the ones that I can play in the background at work and I'll learn a certain something here and there when I tune in. But yeah, this is definitely the type of book you want to take on a walk or a hike.
Right. You really connect with some of those poems when you're like in nature and you're like, wow, I could really smell everything, and you're listening and it feels, let's make another word up, synesthesia. You have like crossing your different senses, smelling colors, and right, naturesthesia. Okay, what's next on your list?
Yeah, I think this is also a classic climate recommendation, but Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and just any of Octavia Butler's work on science fiction. And I remember reading the back of Parable of the Sower and being shocked because basically the story it was written, I believe, in the 1980s or 90s, I think 1980-ish. and it was projecting out to 2020 era, and so what we're living in now. And it was talking about a world that's been ravaged by heat and drought and storms. It's basically how private corporations have become so powerful. They've created these cities where people work in, but if you don't work in one of those sort of corporate-run cities, that you end up living in a state of poverty and in a state of constantly fighting your neighbors for resources, and basically dictates it projects out the world where climate has really made life unbearable and where capitalism has continued to become even later stage, to the point of really siphoning off resources that people have to be collective and fight for them. And so that's the stage of the world that it sets. And it also has a president that talks about making America great again, which when I read that, my mind was blown, because it's what exactly happened, and it feels like a joke, but that's the state of things. And it follows this one girl's journey, Lauren Olamina, through her family, sorry for the spoiler, gets killed for the most part, and it's her journey to try and find a safe place for her and the people that she meets, and the way she has to trust them, and the way they have to create sort of their own little oasis and place of protection, but also alongside that, the development of a religion that she calls Earthseed, which is about, it has a lot of tenets of environmentalism. It's got a lot of sort of spirituality with the environment, and how we like rise above this very like corporate climate dystopia that Butler sets up. And yeah, it's a book that feels kind of discomforting to read, because it's about a lot of difficult topics. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of brutality, but I think it's crazy some of the ways that those things are true. Like when we read titles like Hottest Year on Record or A Big Wildfire Season, all of that, it's very reminiscent of what Parable of the Sower predicted. So another classic, and also really centers what people of color might be facing as well in a future where the disinvestment and oppression continues.
Oh yeah, big time. I really enjoyed it. I think one of the things I took away from the book was the saying, like, everything you touch you change, everything you change changes you. And that, and a lot of stuff with Adrienne Marie Brown's immersion strategy comes together to form a lot of my like foundational core tenets and beliefs in the space of like environmentalism, and how we like transition from this extractive world that we live in, and how we make this transition an equitable one, rooted in justice, and individually and as communities. And so, yeah.
I could not agree more. That was another book that I read last year, Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. Side note, she has a term for, like a gender-neutral term for nieces and nephews called nibblings. And I really love that. It's gender-neutral. It's really great. Like siblings, but nibblings. Yeah, but I would love to also hear what you have been reading and what you would recommend as your top couple of climate books.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I feel like last year I read a lot of climate books, but also tied in with urbanism, but also tied in with like adjacent topics that sort of touch all of them. I think the one that like really sticks out to me was The Heat Will Kill You First by Jeff Goodell. And it talks about how extreme heat, how deadly it is. Like every summer we feel it's getting hotter. And we always hear about how it's the hottest year on record and we're breaking records each and every year. But we don't think about how extreme and how bad and deadly extreme heat is. In fact, it's the deadliest climate hazard in the whole world, which is insane to think about, because we have earthquakes, wildfires, and tsunamis, and hurricanes, everything. But like extreme heat is sneaky dangerous, because like it happens very slowly. It seems like it can happen also quickly, but it happens slowly, and we don't really like think about it too much. But then it also has tons of implications with like the built environment, because then folks who have access to air conditioning can sort of shelter themselves from the real world, from the extreme heat that's out there. But then it also like provides this false sense of security that like we're okay because it's getting hotter out there, and we need to like see that and understand that and do all the mitigation and adaptation that we need to prevent that, because there are tons of folks who experience homelessness and who are energy burdened, so they can't turn their AC on. And this is just here in America, but imagine all over the world where like don't have access to some of these things, and so people die, and it's super scary. So it was like a really impactful book for me.
Yeah, I also actually read The Heat Will Kill You First over this Christmas holiday time, and I think it was just a reminder of how much heat touches, like you were saying. It's an issue of urban design, it's an issue of equity, it's a public health issue with, for example, all the species that may thrive in a hotter environment, and then some of those being mosquitoes that spread disease and things that can cause a pandemic. And there's another interesting intersection I learned about where when you're clearing forests or engaging in deforestation, that sounds really passive, engaging in deforestation. When you're causing deforestation, there are certain species that thrive more kind of on the fringes of the environment, going from a forest to a grassland or urban environment, and some of those species are also disease carrying. So it just reminded me just the scope of it, and also the way that, and I don't know if you found this too, sometimes when I communicate with my friends about certain climate hazards, they will try to take me seriously because they care about me and love me, but I don't know if they fully grasp, and not that I want them to be freaked out, but how do you give people education they need to make good decisions? Take enough water when you're going hiking. Maybe don't go hiking if the heat index is above 90. Like, there was that story in The Heat Killed You First about the family that died of heat stroke, and it was so tragic. It's so sad. And they were a family with better understanding of the built environment and hiking and more fluency with nature. And so for people who just want to go hiking randomly, or like where I grew up in Bakersfield, like it's 100 degrees in the summer, don't take a walk. And that's also very easy for me to say because I have a comfortable air-conditioned home, a car to drive in. I don't have to be taking the bus when I'm home. And so it's how do you like in giving that kind of education, you also unearth the inequities that people have to face and what resources they don't have and all of that. But yes, also such an important book. And yeah, urban heat is something I'm getting more and more interested in. I've always been kind of passionate about topics like that really expose kind of injustice in the built environment and how to address that. But we're quite literally living in a hotter world. So
yeah, we are. And it's super scary. And you bring up a lot of really good points. And just, yeah, it's a lot because it's something we all feel. But then again, one reason I recommend it for folks is because, like you're saying, it touches on everything: built environment, being outside, public health, and yeah, like you're saying, little stuff like drinking water. However much water you're drinking, you're probably not drinking enough, and that's also not enough to keep you cool, because like your internal temperature is rising, your external temperature is rising, like you're losing water faster than you're drinking it. And so like if you have the privilege to have AC and stay inside, like do that. And anyway, we could talk about this book all day, but there's that. And then one climate adjacent book I read was Poverty by I forget who it's by.
Is it Matthew Desmond?
Yes, Matt Desmond. He did Evicted. He wrote Evicted also. And I really enjoyed that just because it like radicalizes you even more in thinking about a lot of the extractive systems that exist. And one reason it's not quite climate exactly. It's not really about climate, but it's about a lot of folks' inequities in the US specifically. And when you think about climate and we talk about who's vulnerable, it's folks who are experiencing these inequities who are the most vulnerable. And so it sort of makes it even more so important that we work hard to improve the world, not just because of climate, but when climate happens, whether it's an extreme heat wave that happens or whatever other climate hazard, like those are the folks who don't have a place to run to protect themselves. And so it's super important to be able to think about that. And then the last book that really stuck out to me is called Paved Paradise. It's a book about land use and parking, and how much space parking takes, and how it really determines how we build, where we build, how it makes everything super expensive, how it induces us to drive. And again, it's not specifically climate, but it's one of those books I think when you read it and you're thinking about climate issues while you read it, it sort of opens your eyes to everything, because cars cause tons of emissions, but yet we build a world that demands us to drive because we require parking. And so when there's parking, you have to drive. And if you have to drive, we're driving, and that causes emissions. And it sort of like feeds the cycle, and thinking about, also leads to like urban sprawl, and thinking about the way we use land, because in order to build, we have to deforest areas, cutting down green space to pave it over, which in paving those surfaces over induces like the urban heat island effect, which when there are more impermeable surfaces, then heat is absorbed into the surfaces. And so then it just causes and traps greenhouse gases and makes it even hotter in urban areas, in more gray areas. And so Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar, that's another good book that, again, isn't specifically climate, but it's important to I think it's still important to read. I call them like climate adjacent books when you're thinking about and interacting with the world around you. Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited to read it. And yeah, land use is a big part of how we adapt to climate and adapt our built environments, particularly, which of course is the bias that we both have. But yeah, definitely want to read that. And I think this reminded me, both of us are trying to forego car ownership as long as possible. And ideally, I mean, I live in San Francisco, which I think is more conducive to that. You're doing it in LA, which I think is so incredible and inspiring. But it just reminds me of yet another reason of to avoid paved paradises, how do we create transit and create mobility across the board in a way that's helpful? So yeah, I'm adding that to my shelf for sure.
So the next section is on podcasts, but let's quickly review the books we recommended. If you're looking to get into climate and sustainability, there are several places and types of books you can read to get started on. Shika suggested some in nature and commentary books like Braiding Sweet Grass and All We Can Save. These can help you connect with nature and reflect in a peaceful way. There are climate fiction books like Parable of the Sower, which are eerily on the money with their predictions about the future. There are books that talk about specific climate hazards like The Heat Will Kill You First. And finally, there are climate-adjacent books, I say that in quotes, that will further your understanding of the root or adjacent systems that will be impacted by the climate crisis. We mentioned Poverty by Matt Desmond and Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar. We could also explore other topics such as policing with books like The End of Policing, and capitalism with books like Earth for All. Do you have any book suggestions? Comment below if you can, or head over to Instagram and comment on the trailer for this pod to share your favorites.
Yeah. Okay. Next is podcasts. So reading is one thing, and I highly recommend you all get your library card and borrow books, buy them if you want, but check out audiobooks. But another way to connect with climate sustainability topics and sort of on a quicker turnaround, books are great, but you can't always be reading books and you have to find the time for it. But podcasts are a great way to, whether it's deep dives into topics or more like news-based. So like something's happened, earthquake has happened, and you want to learn more about that, or a bill's being passed, and how does that impact me? So then you listen to a podcast that can inform that. And so with that, can you share one or two podcasts that you enjoy listening to?
Yeah, and this is definitely a place I want to increase my podcast knowledge and awareness. I've been on my kick of fun, silly podcasts that are just meandering and don't teach me much, just make me laugh. But I do want to make space for more intentional listening as well. But two that I've listened to in the past that I've really enjoyed are Drilled by Amy Westervelt, and who has a more legal background but does a lot of reporting and coverage on climate, litigation, and just a lot of great coverage on what's happening related to legislation and all of that too. And Drilled specifically, the first season was really revealing the history of how oil companies changed the narrative about oil, natural gas, fossil fuels, and made us believe that they were okay to use and that we deserve to use them, and really got into the details to that podcast is probably what really radicalized me to believe that fossil fuel companies took away so much of that future, that soul nostalgia.
They're evil.
We were talking about it. Yeah, literally. So Drilled is a really great one. I haven't listened to all of the seasons, but they do a lot of great coverage on different important climate legislation. And litigation and specifically battles happening in the courts about that as well. So more seasons to listen to, but that one really, like, if you want to hear how Bell Labs and Chevron and Exxon, I can't even remember at this point, but all the evil things they did to tamp down science in the last 50 years.
It's insane, honestly, and it makes me feel like, dude, even the term natural gas, it's not natural, and whether we want to call it fossil gas, unnatural gas, like that sort of greenwashing. And now I'm even seeing stuff like clean natural gas, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. I remember seeing reports from, like, I think Exxon in the 1970s, them talking about how what they're doing is worsening climate and is gonna lead to more climate disasters in the future, and they're like, let's keep those buried.
No, totally. They completely sacrificed our long-term livability for short-term profits and for their cushy lives. And it just irks me that COP is continually overrun by fossil fuel delegates and fossil fuels. I believe there are more fossil delegates than members of island nations.
I believe that.
The other podcast I want to recommend was Hot Take, which is actually also by Amy Westerveld and Mariana Hegler, both of whom are climate journalists and just really cool people in the space, bringing a lot of really interesting stories and quality writing to the world. But their podcast is definitely sort of climate justice oriented, trying to talk about big topics. Like, they did a great breakdown episode of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and all that it does, but also all that it doesn't, and whether it matches the pace that we need to actually be operating at to fully address the climate crisis. Like, we can be so grateful for this first step, but this should be looked at as a first of many steps. But yeah, Mariana Hegler is the one who created a troll account for BP. So just like trying to bother them on social media, which I just think is iconic behavior. I believe she got blocked by BP, which means
understandable, but but we need that. We need to cut through the stuff that we normalize to sort of wake us up to what's happening.
But yeah, those are my two. And then I also really enjoy 99% Invisible, just to understand how different design decisions are made. It's a climate adjacent podcast.
Yeah.
But I think it brings together urban design, climate, and just, again, being more thoughtful about the world that we live ourselves in to be more engaged and therefore more active for it.
Oh yeah, for sure. 99PI definitely was one of those podcasts that I remember listening to my first year in undergrad, and it just making me think so much about the world, and like everything is designed intentionally, which is both super cool but also so scary because all the negative stuff intentionally designed. There are no accidents.
There are no accidents. No, and it's like when I was doing my human rights minor, like a theme that kept coming up in different work that I was reading is you entrench human rights in what you build. What would it look like if we built a world where you didn't need sight, for example, like a world in which both people with sight and without sight could benefit? What about a world where neurodivergent people were centered in the creation? What about a world where non-able-bodied people were centered in the creation? So it's just like there's always a norm that we're designing around, and who are we excluding with that norm?
Oh, that's fire. That is fire. Yeah, that's awesome. So, podcast that I listen to. Drill is good. I love Drill, like you said. I'm trying to always find all kinds of different podcasts to listen to. So there's one called Living Change by Andrea Learned. I really enjoyed that one. She interviews leaders who are demonstrating the things that they're preaching. So usually they're like elected officials or leaders of companies. Imagine you're elected official who rides the bus or rides an electric bike around the city or eats plant-based food. And when you see your leaders doing the things that they're preaching, I hope they're preaching, that it just makes it easier for you to believe that and to buy into it. So that's a really good podcast. I also like Arrested Mobility. It's by Professor Charles Brown, and he coined this term called arrested mobility that looks at that says that the world, the built environment we live in is proportionally designed. So if you're usually like black, brown, or marginalized person, there are more structural barriers that exist that make it harder to exist in society, exist in public spaces. And so that one really like attunes my mind to thinking about mobility and what sort of structural barriers exist. I also recently started listening to, it's called the UCLA Housing Voice podcast that talks primarily about housing issues, and that's really cool. It's sort of a a deeper dive into some of the issues. So we think about affordable housing, we think about people experiencing homelessness, but it takes one step of a deeper dive into thinking about what are the structural forces behind it, what's the real data behind it, and what are ways that we are actively working to address it. And so that's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. And so yeah, definitely worth adding to your rotation.
All of those recommendations I'm about to add, but yeah, I feel like housing is an issue I am very passionate about and have not maybe explored as much through coursework and project work just yet. And there have definitely been projects that have come up, but not I'm still kind of getting my hands into it. And so I think I definitely want to be like re-engaged into all the different forces behind affordable housing. And especially in San Francisco, there's a lot of discussion about the need for more affordable housing and in all of these big cities where it's hard when we think about urbanization and the fact that more and more people are going to live in these cities, but the fact that these cities are already so unequal, and how do people's experiences living in a city depend on what neighborhoods they can live in, how long they have to commute to different places. And yeah, that also goes into the podcast you're mentioning, Arrested Mobility, about how housing then links to transportation, which then links to the whole picture, which is what Fostering Our Earth also tries to help elucidate. So anyways, all that to say, very excited for some engaged listening. Some learning listening is what I'm going to call it.
Okay. Lastly, it would just be, how do you respond to all that you're engaging with? Because you do this work at your actual job, you're reading these books. I guess you have silly podcasts, which great. We need to laugh. But I feel like there's maybe some sense of could be doom and gloom that might come from seeing, oh man, another insert climate hazard here, or sad news or whatever. Like, how do you respond to all of this?
That is a great question, something I'm still actively thinking about. And I think, like, sort of what you said is having different forms of media and knowing when you've consumed one of too much, and that's weighing on you in a way that you can't do the work that you want to do, and switching gears. So kind of when I'm in my learning mode, acknowledging that, seeking out podcasts that will teach. And when I am a little overwhelmed or not in a learning mode, or my brain is not going to be paying attention, seeking out kind of those fun, silly podcasts, or maybe re-listening to a podcast I've listened to in the past and just want to take some tidbits away from. So I think, like, I've also come to realize I've gotten really desensitized to news and articles, which is not something I'm proud of, or I think it's part of just being overly inundated with news all the time. Like, there's this one podcast I listened to, Bingetopia, and this theme has come up too, but it talks about how, like, humans were not meant to process this much information at once. Like, we're the first generation that has this constant flow of news, social media, articles, books, like, there's so much content in this world that it's so easy to just go in like 50% to all of it, or even less. And so I think this year, one of my New Year's intentions, just because I like calling them intentions, just because it's like a couple of ways of grounding yourself, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't need to be resolved this year. Like, your learning takes what it does, is to try and slow down the way I consume information. And so that's part of the step back of social media. That's part of turning off podcasts when I'm not actively listening to them. And I think books are a big help to me. I think books really slow down the way I process information, and I have time to sit with like one narrative and one set of stories and read them in all of their nuance. So even if it is foregoing maybe staying as up to date I want to on current events and current crises, I try, like, I think books is the form that I probably learn the most in and feel the most in, and also have room for both the hope and the difficulty. Like, you go through all the arcs and all of that. And then I also think it's just, being mindful of, like, if I'm not paying attention, it's not content that I'm absorbing. So, like, it's okay to not be absorbing that much if what I absorb is resonant to me, or I'm learning from it. So I think with handling it all, it's really just trying to slow the pace of what I'm reading. Like, my book goal last year, my goal was to read less books than I did in the year before, because I had a very high book goal and I was like running towards it and was really excited and felt accomplished. And then the following year I was like, but am I proud of everything that I read? And do I feel like I learned? So I think it's just a matter of trying to be more mindful about my consumption, and also be okay with, quote unquote, knowing less if, like, what I know more is of, like, higher quality, or, like, I'm able to actually talk about it. And another way of, like, absorbing content is talking about it with friends. Like, just talking to you, I feel so much more inspired to read and get involved. And it has a way of holding me accountable to actually reflecting on what I'm reading. Because I think one thing I want to do this year is like write a little mini review of every book I read, because the one year I did that was during the pandemic, and I love going back to those and reading how I felt about a book and seeing how much I engaged with it. So if I have the energy, I would like to read a book, sit with it for a little bit, and then read the next one. And balancing, like, as much as we both care about climate, we're also passionate about other things. And so having those to turn to. And yeah, it's nice to also have activities that are not just like reading, learning, do like activities of like going outside, hiking. I like to dance, like cooking, like all these other activities that add meaning. So we could be more engaged when we're thinking about it. So yeah, those are my thoughts, but I'm really curious to hear about your approaches to managing information, because I feel like sometimes I wish I knew more about certain things that I'm working in or care about.
Yeah. No, this is that everything you're saying is so beautiful, Shika. Like, I resonate with you. I think you're right. We consume a lot, and that's why I have this sort of section to, it's like, what do we do? How do we respond? And one of those for me is to talk. I like talking about these issues. Every time we catch up, I'm learning so much, but it's not just about learning. It's also just about processing and reflecting, and yeah, that matters. And I talk to folks who aren't as informed, which is okay, because then they ask me questions and then it makes me pull from different sources and like share that, and there's something exciting that comes from sharing about the world with someone else. But then, like you're saying, it's a lot to process, because there's always stuff happening all the time. Like, we'll never be an expert at everything, and I mean, like we said, we work in this space, but I just think like that's okay. And I also like your point, and I think it's good for me too, in that in reflecting through activities, like you're saying, like going outside, meeting other people, spending time with friends, and like not having this be the only thing that fills your life, you know? And so, yeah.
Yeah. No, snaps to all of that. And I was going to say, I'm also like I say all these intentions while also waking up to scrolling on like through articles on my phone this morning. And to like, my thumb just keeps going to like, I don't have Instagram, the app anymore, but I have now defaulted to Facebook, which is like just actually like worse content. So I'm still like recognizing all of this in myself, but I'm trying to be like, okay, at least I know when I'm doing it a little bit more, because it's the mindlessness that can be so scary. So I feel like sometimes I'll just like throw my phone across the room and like go on a walk or something like that.
Yes. I actually will. I used to like make all my walks, I'm listening to something, audiobooks or podcasts or something. Now I'm like, take headphones off, whatever, just go for the walk. Just listen to whatever is around and like disconnect a little bit.
So innate, it's hard. And I'm reading a couple books by Jenny Odell, which I would also highly recommend. They're climate adjacent in that they talk more about like sort of time, technology, capitalism, and how it all impacts our lives broadly. This is a very broad sweeping assumption, but two of her books, How to Do Nothing, The Art of Resisting the Attention Economy, and 2, Saving Time, both have to do with this idea that there's many amazing ideas through it that I'm only grasping half of, but both of them have to do with like this idea that all of these systems were designed to take our time, and all of these, they're systems broader than us. So like, not to say that we shouldn't, for our own well-being, try to stop scrolling, but like, we also have to realize the real enemy is in the way that these apps are designed and the way that we become dependent on using them for everything. Like, that those are societal trends and structural decisions that were made. Like you said, everything's built intentionally. Like,
everything's designed intentionally. Let's bring it full circle.
Plug for those books too, because they talk a lot about how to like refocus our attention into like what's present. And Jenny Odell is also someone who like will identify plant species and bird species and all of that, and talks about like the way we almost need to have an eye for like an ecological community that we're in, and thinking about that as another element of community. So both books that are not directly climate, but adjacent to climate and how we can process living in the times that we do. to then care about the issues we do.
Oh, that's beautiful. Those are going on the list. Shika, thank you so much for joining me. There were so many more things on this list that we wanted to talk about. So we'll have to like get back on because we could literally be here for hours. We've been on the phone for hours before. And so like this is just like a public phone call that we're just chatting about.
Like once we add in our little life updates and
yeah. We're supposed to call, yeah, let's do like the life updates, like any roommate stuff, any are we moving, are we job stuff, and then this is basically a phone call.
No, this has been so much fun to catch up with you, and always awesome to hear all of your recs. And yes, just very excited with the way Fostering Earth has taken hold. I literally remember you talking to me about this like in like a year or so ago, maybe less.
A little more, yeah,
a little more, maybe, yeah. And just starting to put the foundation. But I think thank you for creating accessible, interesting content, and yes, very, very excited as a fan and very honored to be here.
Yes, and I appreciate your help with editing and reviewing stuff. Y'all might not know this, but like literally I'm always letting Shika, I'm like, Shika, can you please like review this please and like make sure it's accurate and interesting and whatnot. And so I appreciate your help and your feedback and your support. And free to jump on this with me and like rest of this conversation.
No, of course. And to be clear, I do like maybe 1%. Yes, I'm excited to help in any way I can.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll cut the recording here.
All right, folks, that's it for this opener to season 2 of Fostering Our Earth. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you missed any of the recommendations, you can find them in the show notes below. If you got any suggestions, definitely comment them below. Like I mentioned, this kicks off season 2 of Fostering Our Earth. Each month for the first 6 months of 2025, we'll be diving deep into topics related to embodied carbon, housing, local transportation, food and land justice, and resilient planning, with some really awesome folks doing some incredible work. Make sure you're subscribed to both the podcast and the Substack. Links are in the description below. Keep fostering your Earth today for a better future tomorrow. All right, y'all. Peace.